The galaxy had known many wars, but none so devastating as the conflict that now swept through star systems. Planets fell one after another under the shadow of a powerful enemy known as the Draxian Horde. And in desperation, two great civilizations set aside their mistrust. The humans from the far Spiral Arm and the Vyari royal race of the Core Worlds signed a fragile alliance, not out of friendship but survival. Yet even alliances born from fear could hold the seeds of something greater. Vyari court decided that Princess Leora, youngest daughter of the royal line, would travel to the human-controlled front lines as a sign of trust. She was graceful and proud with silver markings along her skin that shimmered when light touched them, though she hid her fear well inside. Her heart pounded at the thought of leaving the safety of the palace for the chaos of war. Her advisors warned her that humans were unpredictable, some even dangerous, but her father insisted she must go, for symbols sometimes meant more than armies. Her arrival at Fort Ardent was nothing like she imagined. Instead of golden halls or warm greetings, she found walls scarred from recent attacks, soldiers move in with grim purpose, and the cold air of a world barely fit for life. Among them stood a tall human warrior named Kale, his armor worn but polished, his gaze steady but unreadable. He was assigned as her escort, and from the first moment she met his eyes, something inside her shifted. A strange pull she could not explain. They spoke little at first, her questions met with short answers, his presence silent yet watchful. But it was during an unexpected ambush that things changed. The Draxian launched a sudden strike on the convoy carrying supplies to the fort. Leora found herself caught in the middle of blaster fire and shrieking enemy craft. Panic surged through her as she tried to take cover, but before fear could swallow her, Kale was there, moving like the wind, his blade flashing in the cold air. His steps precise and unshaken, every strike pushing the enemy back. He shielded her with his own body, guiding her through burning wreckage until they reached safety. His voice calm even as danger roared around them. When it was over, Leora looked at him with wide eyes, the weight of his courage pressing deep into her thoughts. She thanked him, her words soft but sincere, and though his reply was a simple nod, she saw the faintest hint of warmth in his expression. From that day, Kale remained at her side, whether standing guard during tense negotiations or guiding her through the rough terrain outside the fort. The more time she spent near him, the more she noticed small details. The way he moved with a quiet confidence, the way he scanned every room before entering, the way he spoke rarely but with meaning, and sometimes she caught him glancing at her when he thought she would not notice. A look not of duty alone, but of something unspoken. At night, in the small chamber given to her at the fort, Leora found herself dreaming, flashes of a long-forgotten ceremony, the sound of vows spoken in a language she barely understood, the warmth of a hand holding hers, and the face of a man wearing a ceremonial mask. The details blurred yet strangely familiar. She would wake with her heart racing and a lingering feeling of loss she could not explain. Despite the alliance, tension remained high. Whispers in the corridors spoke of betrayal, and more than once she heard her own guards mutter warnings to stay distant from the human warrior. But Leora could not ignore the quiet comfort his presence brought, especially when the world around her felt ready to collapse. And though she told herself it was foolish, she began to trust him more than anyone else in the camp. One evening, after a long day of negotiating supply routes with stubborn human commanders, Leora stepped outside to clear her thoughts. The cold air bit at her skin, but she stayed, staring at the stars, wondering how long before the war consumed them all. Kale appeared beside her without a sound, standing a respectful distance, his voice low as he told her the constellations humans used to navigate before they had machines to guide them. There was a calm in his tone that made her forget the war for a moment. A quiet space where the world seemed far away. She asked him why he fought with such determination, expecting an answer of duty or honor, but instead, He paused, as if the truth was too heavy to share, and simply said there were promises worth keeping, even if no one remembered them. The words stayed with her long after he walked away, stirring something deep inside her, something she did not yet understand that night. She took from her travel chest a small pendant she had kept since childhood, an old keepsake with no clear origin, its metal warm against her palm, and as she studied it, she could not shake the feeling that it belonged to a story she had forgotten. A story that somehow connected her to the human warrior, who now guarded her life without hesitation and far beyond the fort walls. Unseen by either of them, the enemy gathered their strength, preparing a strike that would not only test the fragile alliance but also uncover truths that had been buried for years. Truths that could change everything Leora thought she knew about herself and the man who had saved her life. The days at Fort Arden passed with a strange rhythm. Battles at the edges of the sector came and went, news of victories and losses carried in by weary messengers. Princess Leora moved among soldiers and officers, learning more about the human way of war and survival. Yet no matter how busy the days became, her eyes always seemed to find Kale, the warrior who had saved her life. The man who walked like shadow in steel. She noticed the way he studied every path before she walked it, how his hand never strayed far from the hilt of his weapon, how his voice was steady even when orders from above caused tension among the troops. Some said he had fought in more battles than anyone in the fort. Others whispered that he carried scars from a war that was not recorded in any history she could read. To Leora, he was a mystery wrapped in calm strength. On missions beyond the walls, she often rode beside him, their path sometimes quiet except for the hum of the transport and the distant sounds of alien wildlife. Other times he would share brief stories of distant worlds, of frozen moons where the air turned to crystals in your lungs, of jungle planets where a single night could claim the unprepared. His words painted pictures she could almost see, and she wondered how many lives he had lived before this war. The strange pull she had felt the day they met did not fade. Instead, it grew, each shared moment weaving an unseen thread between them. Yet she kept her thoughts locked behind her royal composure. She was a princess, he was a soldier. Their worlds could not mix without consequence. Still, when his eyes met hers, there was something there, something that felt like recognition. One afternoon, a supply run turned dangerous. Their convoy passed through a canyon where the walls rose high and shadows cut the light into strips. Kale ordered the lead driver to slow, but the warning came too late. The sound of blaster fire echoed from above and enemy troops poured from the cliffs. Chaos erupted. Soldiers scrambled for cover as enemy fighters descended. Leora felt the sharp heat of a blast strike the ground near her feet. Before fear could root her in place, Kale was there, pulling her behind a rock wall. His shield taking the next hit meant for her. The fight was fierce and short, Kale cutting a path through the attackers with precision. But as they retreated, Leora caught sight of something, a pendant swinging from a chain around his neck. Half hidden by armor, her heart skipped because it was nearly identical to the one she kept in her private chest. A piece from her earliest years whose origin she could never explain. She wanted to ask him about it, but the moment passed as quickly as it came, and he was already moving the survivors forward. That night sleep refused to come. The image of the pendant burned in her thoughts. She opened her own chest and held her pendant in her palm, turning it over, feeling its weight. Memories stirred. At the edges of her mind, flashes of music, a great hall filled with banners, the touch of a hand she could not clearly see, and a deep voice promising something she could not remember. It felt important, like a story just beyond reach. She pressed the pendant to her lips before placing it back and closing the lid. Over the next days, her dreams grew stronger. The masked man from her youth appearing more clearly, his hand warm in hers, his voice saying words in a quiet language, words she felt more than understood. When she woke, the feeling stayed with her, a mix of longing and loss. And each time she looked at Kale, she could not help but wonder if the answer to her dreams was standing before her. But life at the Fork did not pause for personal mysteries. The Draxian horde pressed harder, raiding supply lines, cutting communication towers, forcing humans and Vayari to fight side by side more than ever. Leora joined Kale on several missions, learning not just about war but about trust. She saw how he risked himself for others without hesitation, how he never left a soldier behind, how he stood his ground even when outnumbered. And each act of courage pulled her deeper into the silent question of who he truly was. One evening, heavy rain fell on the fort, washing the dust from the stone walls. Leora walked through the outer courtyard and found Kale under the shelter of a small archway, his armor set aside, his tunic damp, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if seeing something far beyond the storm. She asked if he missed his home, and he answered, not in the way she expected. He said home was not a place but a promise, and some promises once made could never be broken. Even if time and memory tried to erase them, her chest tightened at his words. The storm seemed to fade for a moment, replaced by the echo of a long-ago vow she could not name. She wanted to ask him what promise he meant, but before she could speak, an alarm sounded through the fort, a signal of an enemy approach. Kale gave her one last look before turning away, his voice calling orders as he moved into action, leaving her with 100 unspoken questions. From the ramparts that night, Leora watched the soldiers prepare for battle, the air heavy with the smell of wet stone and the tension of waiting. She saw Kale below moving through the troops, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos. And for reasons she could not yet understand, she felt safer knowing he was there. As if no matter what came, he would stand between her and the storming, the quiet that followed. After the enemy scouts were driven back, Leora returned to her chamber and stood at the window, the rain now soft, her pendant warm in her palm. Somewhere in the shadows of her mind, the pieces were moving, slowly drawing a picture she could not yet see. But she knew one thing for certain. Her life had changed the moment she met the human warrior. And the bond growing between them was more than alliance, more than trust. It was something old. Something waiting to be remembered. And beyond the walls of the fort, the true storm was gathering. One that would not only test the fragile bond between princess and warrior, but reveal truths neither of them were ready to face. The air over Fort Ardent grew heavier with each passing day, as if the very sky knew something was coming. Patrols returned with darker news. Villages burned at the edge of the sector, enemy ships gathering in numbers that could not be ignored. Princess Leora felt the pressure in every meeting. Her people's trust in the alliance was fragile. One wrong move and the fragile thread could snap. Kale moved through these days with the same steady discipline as before. Yet Leora noticed a quiet shadow in his eyes, as if he too carried a burden that had nothing to do with the current war. He trained soldiers with precision, led scouting missions without complaint, and stood guard outside her chamber when others rested. But when she looked at him too long, she saw a question there, unspoken and heavy. It was during a mission to a remote outpost that the first real crack appeared. Their team had been sent to deliver supplies to a unit cut off by Draxian forces. The path took them through a ravine where the air smelled of iron and the rocks glistened with moisture. Halfway through, the canyon walls erupted in fire. The enemy had been waiting. Blaster fire filled the air. Soldiers scrambled for cover. Kale pushed Leora behind a fallen transport, shielding her with his own body. As he returned fire in the chaos, an enemy soldier leapt from the ridge above. Landing hard in front of them, Kale met him head-on, their blades clashing in a shower of sparks. The fight was fierce and desperate, and when Kale finally struck the enemy down, his helmet was torn away in the struggle. For the first time, Leora saw his face without the full armor of battle, and her breath caught. Not because of fear, but because she knew that face. She had seen it in her dreams, every line and scar etched into her mind. Before she even knew his name, a deep scar cut across his jaw. The exact same mark she remembered touching in the vision of her masked partner from years past. The memory hit her so hard she almost forgot the battle raging around them. Cale noticed her stare but turned away quickly, pulling his helmet back, on as if to hide what she had seen. They fought their way out of the ravine and reached the outpost. But the silence between them on the return journey was louder than any gunfire. That night Leora could not sleep. She sat at her desk with the pendant in her hand, her mind racing. The dreams that had haunted her for weeks now burned bright in her thoughts. She remembered a hall lit by gold light, her younger self standing before a masked man, their hands joined in a formal vow, the voice speaking words of unity, of a bond meant to bridge two worlds. She had thought it a story or a dream, but now the scar, the pendant, and Cale's eyes told her it was something far more real. She found him in the training yard at dawn, the air cold, his blade cutting through the mist with practiced ease. She stepped forward and called his name. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. She asked him where he had gotten the pendant he wore. His hand went to it instinctively, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he told her it was a relic from a promise made long ago, a promise he was told to forget. She pressed him for the truth, her voice steady though her heart pounded. Cale's gaze shifted as if weighing whether to speak. Finally he told her of a time before the current war, when peace between humans and Vayari had been close, when the leaders of both worlds had arranged a ceremonial bonding between a human warrior and a Vayari princess to seal the alliance. He had been chosen for that role, though he had never seen the princess's face without the ceremonial veil. The bond had been sealed with vows and pendants, one for each of them. But the treaty failed within weeks, and the event was buried. In silence, the leaders feared enemies would target those involved, so the memory of the ceremony was erased from records. And Cale himself had undergone a procedure to blur parts of his memory for his own safety. Yet fragments remained fragments he had carried like shadows through the years. He admitted that when he met Leora, something in him had stirred, something that felt like the return of a piece he had lost, but he had pushed it aside, thinking it was only familiarity born of shared battles. The truth struck Leora like a storm. She realized that the masked man in her dreams had been Cale all along. The bond they had formed on the battlefield was the echo of a bond made long before. She felt anger at those who had hidden it, sorrow for the years lost, and a strange, overwhelming relief that the man she had come to trust was not only her protector, but her true husband. In the eyes of their people, Cale looked at her as if waiting for her judgment, his voice low as he said he would understand if she wished to. Keep the past buried. The war was dangerous enough without adding politics and forgotten vows to the weight they carried. But Leora stepped closer, her eyes fixed on his. She told him the truth could not be buried forever, and that perhaps it had returned now for a reason. Before they could speak further, the alarm bell rang across the fort, messengers shouting that the Draxian fleet had launched a full assault on the capital of the Vayari homeworld. Leora's heart twisted with fear for her people. Cale's hand tightened on his weapon, a moment between them breaking as the weight of war crashed back. And they moved quickly. Orders flying, soldiers preparing for deployment, ships fueling for the jump to the capital. But in the space between those hurried moments, Leora caught Cale's gaze once more, and in it she saw not just the warrior, not just the protector, but the man who had once stood beside her in a golden hall and promised to fight for her always. And as the sky above Fort Ardent filled with the streaks of departing ships, she knew that the coming battle would not only decide the fate of their worlds, but whether the bond they had rediscovered could survive the fire that awaited them. The journey to the Vayari capital was a blur of urgency and steel. Warships cutting through space with engines burning bright, the decks alive with soldiers moving in tight formations. Princess Leora stood on the command bridge watching the stars streak past, her heart heavy with the truth she had learned, and the danger that now awaited her people. Kale stood a few steps behind her, his presence silent yet unshackable. A wall between her and the chaos of the galaxy. When they arrived above the capital, the sight stole the breath from her chest. The once beautiful city of crystal towers and golden domes was burning. Plumes of black smoke rose into the sky as enemy. Ships rained fire upon the streets. The palace where she had grown up stood like a wounded giant, its outer walls broken, the shields flickering under the constant assault. The fleet commander gave the order to deploy ground forces, and Kale moved to her side, ready to lead her through the storm. They descended into the heart of battle. The roar of engines replaced by the cries of civilians fleeing through the shattered streets. The ground shook under the force of bombardments. Veari guards fought alongside human soldiers holding the line where they could. Kale kept Leora Close's movements sharp and precise, cutting down any Draxian warrior that came near. Yet the deeper they pushed toward the palace, the more resistance they faced inside the palace. Chaos ruled. Ministers shouted over each other. Soldiers tried to hold barricades as enemy troops pressed in. Leora took command of her father's council with a voice that carried above the noise, giving orders to evacuate the wounded and secure the archives. But as she worked to steady her people, a shadow moved through the ranks. One of her own advisors stepped forward, his words smooth yet poisoned, accusing her of bringing the enemy to their doorstep by siding too closely with humans. His betrayal struck like a blade in the back. Before she could answer, a group of palace guards turned their weapons on her. They moved fast and with precision. Kale reacted instantly, drawing his blade and cutting two down before they could fire. But in the chaos, more enemy soldiers burst into the hall. A coordinated strike from within and without. Leora shouted for her guards to fall back, yet the traitor had already signaled for her capture. Kale fought like a storm, his movements a blur. But there were too many. One blow sent him to his knees, another strike tore away his weapon. Leora was dragged from the chamber, kicking and shouting his name. She caught a glimpse of his face through the melee. His eyes locked on hers with a promise that he would find her no matter the cost. Then the palace walls closed around her, and the sound of the battle faded into the cold silence of the enemy ship. They took her beyond the capital into the dark reaches of space. The ship's halls lit in dim red light, the air thick with the smell of metal and oil. The Draxian commander visited her cell only once, his words sharp as he explained that she would soon be wed to one of their warlords, an act that would claim the Veari throne for their own. Leora held her head high, refusing to give him the satisfaction of fear. Yet inside she felt the weight of despair pressing against her. Back on the surface, Kale rose from the wreckage of the battle, wounded but alive, the fortifications of the capital in ruins. The Veari forces scattered. The fleet commander urged a retreat, saying the city was lost, but Kale refused. His voice steady as stone as he said the princess had been taken, and he would bring her back. Some of the soldiers rallied to his side, their trust in him greater than their fear. Others warned that a rescue would be suicide, yet Kale only tightened the straps of his armor and prepared to move. He went first to the royal archives, where fragments of the old Alliance records were stored, searching through the damage until he found the sealed chamber that held proof of their forgotten bond. If the enemy intended to use her for power, he would counter with truth. The archivist, who had served her family for decades, looked at Kale with tired eyes, then handed over a small crystal drive containing the hidden marriage record, the words of the old vows preserved in perfect clarity, the proof that she was his wife by both law and ceremony. Kale left the palace ruins that night, under the cover of darkness, taking only a small team of those he trusted. They stole a fast courier ship and vanished into the black, tracking the faint signal of the enemy vessel that had taken her. Every hour he thought of the moment she had been pulled from him. Every step forward fueled by the memory of her gaze and the promise in his heart, a promise older than the war and stronger than the walls of any fortress. Meanwhile, Leora remained in the enemy's grip. Yet she was not without hope. Each night she closed her eyes and saw Kale in her mind, felt the weight of his presence beside her even in the emptiness. She remembered the day they had met, the countless battles they had faced together, and the truth she now knew about the vows they had once spoken. The bond between them was more than memory, it was a living thread. And she believed with every breath that he would follow it to her. Far from the capital, the Draxian ship prepared to rendezvous with the warlord's fleet. The ceremony that would force her into their control only days away. The corridors echoed with the sound of marching boots, guards posted at every door. Yet in the shadows of the outer decks, a small beacon began to blink, unnoticed by the enemy but pulsing in time with the steady beat of a human warrior's heart. Kale had found their trail and was coming closer with every passing moment, and as the stars turned slowly beyond the cell window, Leora stood and gripped the bars, whispering to the cold air that no matter what they tried, no force in the galaxy could keep her from him forever. For the storm that was rising was not just the war between worlds, but the fire of two hearts bound by fate and ready to burn through the darkness together. Enemy ship drifted through the cold dark of space, unaware that the hunter was already in its shadow. Kale's small strike vessel moved silently using the blind spots of the larger ship's scanners, every heartbeat carrying him closer to the one he had sworn to protect. His team waited in silence, their armor darkened to blend with the void, each of them knowing that what lay ahead could cost them their lives. Yet none wavered, for they followed a man whose resolve could not be broken. They made their approach along the maintenance hull, where few guards ever patrolled. Kale led the way, cutting into the metal with a silent tool, the hatch opening into a narrow corridor lit by dim red strips. The air inside was heavy with the hum of engines. They moved quickly through the shadows, striking down lone guards with quiet precision, every step taking Kale closer to the signal he tracked from the beacon he had hidden on Leora during their last mission together. In her cell, Leora sat in the stillness of the night cycle, her mind alert to every sound. When the door opened, she expected another guard, but instead she saw Kale standing there, his eyes fierce yet warm. For a moment neither moved, the world outside forgotten. Then he stepped forward, cutting her restraints and pulling her into his arms. She felt the strength in his hold, the unspoken vow that nothing would part them again. He whispered that they had little time, and they moved together through the dim corridors. The alarm sounded only when they reached the hangar, enemy troops pouring in from both sides, the air filled with the sound of blasters and the clash of steel. Kale fought like a force of nature, his strikes flowing from one enemy to the next. Leora at his side, using a fallen guard's weapon to hold the line, their movements in perfect rhythm, as if shaped by years of battle together. Every enemy that fell brought them one step closer to the ship waiting beyond the hangar doors. Just as they reached the exit, the Draxian commander stepped forward, his armor black and sharp, his voice cold as he told them they could not escape. Kale answered not with words but with steel. Their blades met in a storm of sparks, the clash echoing through the chamber. The fight was brutal, the commander skilled and strong, yet Kale's will burned brighter. With a final strike, he sent the enemy leader to the floor, and the path was clear. They ran for the ship and blasted away from the Draxian vessel into the safety of the void. Their return to the Veari capital was met with shock and disbelief. Many had thought the princess lost forever, yet here she stood beside the human warrior, the bond between them clear to all who saw. But before the council could raise questions or doubts, Kale stepped forward holding the crystal drive given to him by the royal archivist. With the push of a control, the great hall filled with the recorded voice of the old vows. The image of the golden hall and the two figures joined in the ceremonial bond, proof that the princess and the warrior had been united long before the war began. The council was silent, the weight of truth settling over them. No one could deny the law or the bond. The traitor who had helped the enemy was brought forward in chains, his schemes laid bare. The people who had doubted the alliance now saw the living proof of unity. Between human and Vayari, the murmurs in the hall turned to cheers, the sound spreading through the palace and out into the city. A cry of hope in a time of fire and shadow. In the days that followed, the alliance grew stronger than it had ever been. Human and Vayari forces rebuilding the capital together. The Draxian horde pushed back from the outer systems, and Kale was no longer just the warrior who had guarded the princess. He was the prince consort by right and by choice, standing beside her not only in battle but in the halls of leadership. Leora no longer carried the burden of rule alone, for they faced each decision together as they had faced every enemy. On the morning of their public vow renewal, the sky above the capital was clear for the first time in many months. The palace steps were lined with soldiers from both races, banners of blue and gold waving in the wind. Leora walked toward Kale, in the same ceremonial robe she had worn in the old ceremony, though now she saw not a stranger behind the vows, but the man who had saved her life countless times. The man she had come to love in the light of truth, and in the shadow of war they stood before their people and spoke the words again, not as an arrangement made for politics, but as a choice born from trust and battle and a bond that had survived the fire of 2 wars. Cal's voice was steady as he promised to stand with her in peace and in storm. Leora's voice carried over the crowd as she vowed to fight beside him as partner and as wife. The cheer that followed rolled through the streets like thunder. When the sun set that evening, the city lights glowed across the crystal towers. Kale and Leora stood together on the palace balcony, looking out at the world they had fought to save. The scars of war would take time to heal, but the path ahead was clear. For they had proven that the bond between human and Vayari was not just possible, but stronger than the walls of any fortress. And as long as they faced the future together, no enemy could break them. Far above in the night sky, the stars burned bright over a galaxy still filled with challenges. Yet for this moment there was peace, and in the quiet Kale turned to Leora, his voice low but certain as he said that promises once made were meant to be kept. She smiled, knowing that this time nothing would take them from each other. The war had ended, but their journey was only beginning, and whatever lay ahead they would walk it side by side. The end